You're listening to the Otis Jiry channel.
Part 11. Evil Grant. After what seemed like an hour of cramped terror, the car finally stopped at a place neither of them recognized. The driver and the man with the shotgun pulled open both rear drawers. "Come on, out you get," a voice demanded in a surprisingly educated but strangled accent. They half-stepped and half-rolled out of the car, expecting the sound of the end. It didn't come. Instead, they were told to walk along a heavily wooded path which curved away in front of them. They quickly exchanged glances, thinking exactly the same thought. If they hadn't been killed by now, then what fate lay ahead? On they walked until a long, low wooden building came into view. It was obvious to them that it was a laboratory of some sort. BOC gas cylinders were neatly stacked against the wall, chained in place. Through the dirty windows they could see familiar apparatus, glassware, plastic tubing, at least 2 fume cupboards, and wooden benches. As they passed each window, it reminded them of their student days slaving over a hot Bunsen. At the end of the laboratory was an overgrown concrete circle with a metal post at its center, rather like a disused playground with the roundabout removed. No one said a word. There was little to say, and little point in trying to strike up any kind of meaningful conversation. It was this realization of familiar laboratory surroundings which sent shivers down Mark's spine. Ben was expressionless. The hut door swung open, and he came face to face with a short, stout man wearing a scruffy pinstriped suit and bowler hat. It was now that Mark let a smirk appear on his face. It was some enormously expansive, elaborate, practical joke. It had to be with a funny man in a bowler hat, standing there, straight-faced. Mark let out a chuckle. He had been under the powerful, gripping control of adrenaline for too long. He simply let go at the point where his mind now believed it to be safe. "Hello, Ben." A high-pitched voice broke the silence. "Hello, Grant. Long time no see, as they say," answered Ben, quick as a flash. Mark was in such a strange state of mind by now, believing the situation to be a stupid prank, that he burst out laughing at the little man in the bowler. The man behind him violently twisted Mark's arm in response to a casual nod from the man called Grant. Mark lay on the concrete floor with his left arm lying awkwardly behind him, staring with disbelief. Again came the odd high voice. "You're very lucky it wasn't Craig's shotgun. It'll take your head clean off with your shoulders. Mark, the film man." Mark shuddered, half with the pain and half with the realization that his fellow Grant knew about the videos. How could he know? Ben must have told him, he convinced himself. Who could he ever trust again? No one else could know, only Jane. No, it couldn't be her, he thought. But she hadn't come out into the street, had she? His mind went into a whirl and into blackness. The man Craig was a tall, thin person with a pockmarked face and thin, receding dark hair graying at the temples. He always carried his shotgun and looked as if he only needed the smallest of excuses to use it. A surge of cold force brought Mark almost instantly back to reality from his crazy dreaming. Craig stood before him, clasping an empty, dripping, galvanized pail. He wore the strangest of expressions, a sort of schoolboy delight at being in charge. Mark was tied to a chair with his hands bound tightly behind his back. Pain surged from his swollen arm. He sat there, cold and wet though, Craig not moving, just staring. The hut door opened, and in walked Grant, still wearing the bowler hat. "Hello, Mark," he said. "You know, Dr. Carlston and I have had a nice long chat about you." "Oh, yes?" "Yes, we have. He's been telling me more about your little invention. You remember, the gadget for dreamers?" Do you know, at first he would tell me nothing, and so we had to be a little persuasive. Don't you concern yourself about him. You have a job to do here, and you'll do it, he warbled confidently. Untie him. He needs to stretch his legs. Grant and Craig left the room, leaving Mark with the other man. Swiftly untied him and asked if he could stand. "Who are you people?" Mark demanded. To his surprise, the man answered him. "It's better you don't know, although you must have some idea." He spoke in a croaky whisper, as if he had something wrong with his throat. Mark recognized him as the driver. "Where are we going?" Mark questioned, as he was shown the door. "Only a short way, to another lab." Mark carried his left arm in an attempt to ease the pain. Inside the building, he was expertly attended to and received a pain-killing shot in his upper arm. "You'll feel a lot better after that," the man whispered. He was obviously a trained nurse or doctor. He knew exactly what he was doing. "Why are you here in a place like this?" asked Mark. "It's rather a long and complicated story," he said, gesturing for him to lie on the hospital-type couch. "Give it about a half an hour. The pain should ease quite a bit by then." Mark found himself thanking the man who was instrumental in abducting him. He then remembered Carlston. "Where is Carlston? Dr. Carlston, how is he?" He called out after the man left the room. After a pause, the man returned. "Just be thankful you're not in the state he's in." Mark felt his stomach churn. "What do you mean? What state is he in?" he demanded. "I'm going to attend to him again now. He's alive. Just. Poor devil." Grant eventually got the information he wanted. That's all he cares about. Information. And he doesn't care how he gets it either. Believe me, I know. He pointed to his throat briefly, then left the room, leaving Mark alone with his thoughts. Terrible thoughts. He must somehow get to see Carlston. A numbing thought sprang up in his confused mind. If Carlston had given Grant the details of his dream recorder, had he also told him that Jane knew about the contents of the tapes? He then realized that Jane couldn't be the informer, because if she had been, this gang wouldn't have needed him alive to tell them about it. But clearly they did want him alive. He guessed what for. Grant commanded him to recreate his machine there in the laboratory. Mark was told that they would supply any piece of equipment he needed. If he refused, then he would suffer pain he couldn't imagine. Davenport and Carlston were proof enough. There seemed to be no alternative but to comply with Grant's order. He reckoned that during the time necessary to reconstruct the dream recorder, he might figure out some sort of plan to escape this nightmare. Already present in the remarkably equipped laboratory were 2 fully functional EEG recorders, an ECG machine, and all the necessary up-to-date computer-hardened software. Adjustable couches were beside the recorders, but who were going to be the test subjects? Mark listed all the items he would need, and incredibly they arrived within the next few days. He had no idea where it all came from. He was well looked after by the man with the whispering, croaky voice. That was obviously his part in this grim affair. He was called by a strange-sounding name by the others, but when Mark asked, he gave his name as Michael. Mark slept in a small but reasonably comfortable room just along the narrow corridor from the main lab he was working in, with food and drink brought to him by Michael. He didn't hear or see anyone else at all once he started working, building his machine. Uppermost in his thoughts were Jane and Carlston. He had no way of finding out about either of them. Although he couldn't hear them, he sensed that others were somewhere in the long, low lab building shrouded by thick woodland in every direction. He reckoned since he was at one end, they were at the other, including Carlston, who was possibly still alive, or perhaps more likely dead by now. He was about halfway through the construction of his EEG-2 video device one day, about a week later, when he saw the others, but no Carlston. Grant and the gun-toting Craig were moving through the trees and then disappeared from view. About an hour later they returned and made their way toward the other end of the building. Repeated questioning about Carlston or anything which wasn't to do with the work only produced silence. Michael revealed nothing. He knew his life depended on it. Mark now had to sit down and remember the computer program which was committed to memory. The task was harder than he had anticipated. The events of the past week or so and the shock to his system of a badly twisted arm had sapped not only his physical energy but also his mental ability for recall, which usually came as second nature to him. Many trial and error attempts were made until he eventually came up with the goods. In a way, he enjoyed the challenge of repeating and recreating the masterpiece purely from memory. But who was the intended victim to be plugged into it? Towards the end of the second week, the bowler-hatted Grant paid Mark an unexpected visit. He moved quietly to an unnerving position behind him as he was wiring up the electrodes. Then, in a quiet, sickly voice right next to his ear, the evil Grant began to speak. "Everything coming along just fine, is it?" Grant's voice impediment irritated Mark to the point of distraction. He could knock the little fellow to the ground with a single blow, but he knew that would be as far as he got, with Craig lurking about. Besides, he'd had enough pain. He turned to answer Grant. "I think so." "You must know so, Mark. Your well-being depends on it." Grant repeatedly tapped a little stick on the bench right next to him, another of this evil-hearted little man's theatrical props. "Look, you know all those who found out about the Kremlin bomb, and I suppose you'll kill them all off one by one until your sadistic mind's been sated. So why have you got me here building this wretched machine again?" There was a nasty silence. Craig had again moved behind him. His stick came down hard on the hand of his still aching arm, making Mark wince with the sudden pain. "How dare you speak to me like that? It's your first and last warning." Grant left the room, leaving behind the sickly odor of some cheap aftershave and sweat. Mark had smelt it somewhere before. A few days later, the machine was ready. He had serious misgivings about announcing its completion because he didn't know what would happen next. Besides, if he pretended it wasn't ready, he could play for more time in the hope that the police or someone would find him. He knew it would be most unlikely, as this particular department of MI5 was a law unto itself. This little band of heavies were obviously paid to do the dirty work and get results. Soon he could stand the suspense no longer and asked Michael to tell Grant it was ready. A few minutes later, in walked the bowler-hatted wonder. He walked up and down, surveying the work. "Wonderful, Mark. I'm so glad you could manage it with that wonderful brain of yours," he remarked sarcastically. "Now, what's next on my list, you're wondering? Ah, yes. Someone to test it out on to see if it works. Who shall it be?" He stared hard at Mark as he spoke again. "It just happens that we have just the fella." He beckoned over to Michael, who then left the room, returning with a blanket-covered body on a trolley. Grant produced his little stick and flicked back the sheet to expose the face of a heavily bruised, unconscious Ben Carlston. He'd been treated badly, with contusions covering his head, and Mark found it difficult to comprehend that anyone could do this to a fellow human being just for what they knew. "As you can see, Mark, dear Dr. Carlston has not been, what shall I say, helpful, and has met with a slight accident." A hideous smile spread over his face as he tapped Carlston on the head with his stick. Grant was all that was evil rolled into one. Mark had no idea of the damage done to his friend's brain. He could only guess. He was filled with fury and hate for Grant and Craig, the pulsing adrenaline bursts racing like electric shocks through his body, making him shudder. "You barbaric, evil bastard!" he shouted at Grant. "There's no way you'll get away with this." Mark gave up all fear for his own safety. Now things had gone too far. Grant didn't react at all except for that smile again. He then reached inside his pinstripe jacket pocket and held up a blank card for Mark to see. Grant was loving every minute of his foul ways as he slowly turned the card over to reveal a photograph of Jane. Grant burst into hysterical, cackling laughter as he watched the expression on Mark's face change from anger to stark horror at what he saw. Realizing he was beaten, his hand hid his eyes as he slumped into the desk chair. "There! Isn't it amazing what a little photograph can do? So much power, Mark, so much power." He gloated, looking at the photo himself. "Such a pretty girl, if you like that sort of thing." Mark's voice came quietly from behind his hand. "What have I got to do for you to leave her alone? She's done nothing." "Well, I would have thought that was obvious, my boy. Plug him up." He gestured with his eyes toward Carlston. "Want to know what he's dreaming about?" Mark nodded, still with his hand over his face, fighting back the waves of emotion which flowed through him, for Carlston and Davenport, but most of all for the girl he loved and may never see again. Even if she survived it all, he couldn't imagine Grant leaving him alive. He knew far too much. Mark began the sickening task of wiring up Carlston to the EEG recorder. This involved fixing small electrodes to the skin in many different places over his damaged head. They were held in place by an electrically conducting sticky gel with the hair carefully parted to facilitate good electrical contact. The many wires were held in place on Carlston's head by a rubber skull cap. All was now ready as Grant had wished, even though Mark had no guarantee whatsoever for Jane's safety. He went through the setup procedure for each instrument in turn until the final stage of tuning and the monitor to the computer containing the loaded program had become also recalled from memory. He sent Michael to ask when Grant wanted him to start recording the dreams. The message came back that he was to call him the moment any images appeared. Carlston could easily have suffered a great deal of brain damage, judging from the kick marks all over his head and neck. Mark couldn't help thinking that he would have been better off dead. He might survive only to spend the rest of his days in a vegetative state of oblivion. No REM was evident, which compounded Mark's fear of serious brain damage. Days went by with still no evidence of dreaming taking place. Carlston was on a nutrient feed system, just as Fraser had been in Mark's own department. He couldn't help wishing that he could return to those happier times. Everything was now in such a terrible mess, through which he could see no way out. He eventually called for Grant to tell him that it wasn't going to work, as Carlston was more dead than alive. No response. Grant was furious, but didn't take out his anger on anyone. He must have known that such a beating as that would not leave much to work on. Ben Carlston died in the early hours of the following day and was removed from the lab. Mark knew he would be disposed of in some uncaring manner. He wouldn't even have the privilege of attending the funeral of a good and highly thought-of friend which he had become. He couldn't help wondering what the plans the animal Grant had for him. He didn't have to wait long to find out. Somehow Grant had been able to procure a medical doctor, who was most probably blackmailed into Grant's service as Mark had been to wire up his friend. This doctor, introduced as Jim, sat down and showed him a vial containing a solution whose name, labeled Mark, immediately recognized. It was the compound given to him by the research chemist friend at the hospital. "However did you find out about that?" questioned Mark. "It's impossible." "I would have thought you'd have guessed that one," remarked the doctor. "You're Dr. Carlston, did reveal one or two things during his interrogation. He knew you were using this drug on Fraser and where you obtained it. When I was told to get hold of it from your lab, nothing could have been simpler. A doctor in a white coat breezing into a department to collect some drug or other from the fridge? It happens all the time. No one takes the slightest notice, especially with Carlston not being about. Incidentally, there's great concern as to where you both disappeared to. Apparently the police have been asking questions in and around the department, and the neighbors where you live. I overheard Carlston's secretary telling it all to another girl. Mark broke in, excited concern in his eyes. Another girl, you said? What did she look like? Was she quite tall with long black hair? Mark's heart was pounding in anticipation of his reply. No, she definitely wasn't dark. She had one of those short, bleached, spiky haircuts. Utter disappointment showed on Mark's face. Why? Who were you expecting it to be? Jim shook the small vial as he spoke. Oh, I just hoped it would be a friend of mine, that's all. Mark's voice dropped away to a whisper. You work at Addenbrooke's, too? Mark inquired. Yes, I do now. What I mean is I've moved here from a Manchester hospital to gain a wider experience. It's a great hospital here in more ways than one. I've had to hurriedly arrange for a week off for this little game, and I'd only been there for 2 weeks, but they didn't seem to mind. Look, I'm really sorry about all this, especially since you're in the same line of business, but I desperately needed the money. Yeah? You need the money and I need my life. You do know what's going on here, don't you? Well, not really. I wasn't allowed to ask too many questions, just enough to do what I'd been paid to do. In fact, I don't really want to know too much. Well, let me tell you a few facts then, Jim. This is all Secret Service stuff you've got ourselves into. You realize that much, surely. I sort of guessed it might be something like that, he answered, as if he really didn't want to know. Incidentally, asked Mark sarcastically, just what is it you've been paid to do? As if I can't guess. Sorry, but Grant wants you wired up. Carlston was too far gone, as you know. What's to stop us walking out of here? Said Mark optimistically. I hardly see a soul about except for Michael, and I'm sure he'd turn a blind eye or come with us. I wouldn't bank on it. Grant seems to have a hold over all of us. Besides, he's got the whole place neatly tied up, from what little I've seen of this place, warned Jim. Some sort of mirror system linked up to video cameras that look along either side of the building and the ends. Anyway, there's that madman Craig looking around somewhere, the guy with his shotgun, finger glued to the trigger. It was him and some other guy who brought me in here. Without warning, Grant appeared at the door of the lab and casually sauntered over to where the two doctors were sitting. No time for talking, he said, sharply rapping his stick on his bench. His appearance and irritating falsetto voice made his skin creep. He turned to Jim. Put him under, then. What are you waiting for? Grant then leaned towards Mark. I'll never guess what this gentleman's going to do to you, my friend. He's going to hypnotize you, he whispered. Grant gave out a clipped cackle of insane laughter. Jim and Mark exchanged glances. He'll never do it, Mark confidently proclaimed, but had little choice but to climb up onto the surgical couch in response to Jim's gesture. He turned down the room lighting and switched on a strobe light aimed about a foot from Mark's squinting eyes. Eyes shut or not made a little difference, the light was too intense. Jim adjusted the flashing intervals gradually until a moment was reached when the frequency of the flashing seemed to coincide and resonate with Mark's natural body frequency. He was then given an injection of the enhancement compound. That should do it, said Jim, looking into Grant's evil eyes. Interesting. Very interesting what you medical chappies can do, Grant replied. Mark shuddered and convulsed violently, then lapsed into unconsciousness. The next 30 minutes or so were spent placing the electrodes over Mark's head and plugging him into the electroencephalograph. The rest of the machinery array had remained set up since Carlston's preparation. Before he went under, Mark had made a serious attempt to make his mind a blank, although he didn't think for one moment that it would work, especially for someone like himself who had a marvelous memory which would presumably work against his conscious wish to blank out all thoughts. Grant remained in the room as Jim monitored the output on the pen recorder and video screen. The results showed the characteristic trace of an unconscious person. They now had to wait for the REM sleep period to begin. Both Jim and Grant looked forward to seeing just what Mark's invention was capable of, but for very different reasons. Jim for technical reasons, and Grant to obtain the evidence he needed of exactly what Mark knew, if indeed he thought or dreamt of the particular events which were relevant to Grant's expectations. At last, after a long wait, mostly in silence, as the two men had very little they wished to speak of to one another, Mark's eyes showed movement under the lids. Both turned to watch the screen. An image appeared showing unclear flashes of what appeared to be speeded-up vision of the construction of electronic circuitry. Mark was recalling parts of the complicated building of his device. The next sequence of events in Mark's mind were very much clearer. A picnic scene came into view. A girl, Jane, sat amidst a display of food and drink on an enormous table, cloth with clear images of her face appearing intermittently. Grant was beginning to nod off to sleep, perched on the corner of the bench. Jim certainly wouldn't tell him if anything significant came up, and the video recorder wasn't yet running. Grant suddenly came to his senses as he gradually slipped from the corner of the bench. This joke of a man and his affected mannerisms were amusing to watch, but the humor was soured by his grossly perverted mind and sadistic tendencies. Unfortunately for Jim, Grant sensed his stifled smirk threatening to spread out into laughter. With lightning speed, he thrashed his stick across Jim's face, and droplets of blood formed along the gash dripping onto his white coat. "You bastard!" he yelled as he left his seat, and flew at Grant with his feet leaving the ground. A violent struggle followed as Jim tried to silence the evil chaplain parody. Grant was held down by the heavily built doctor, crumpling the wretched bowler as he always wore. A hideous, high-pitched, pig-squealing scream left Grant's mouth before Jim could jam his hand over it. The door flew open to reveal the equally sadistic Craig, complete with his shotgun. The doctor lifted Grant to his feet in one great heave as he screeched out an order for Craig to shoot. Jim knew he could hit Grant as well, so stuck him in line of fire. Just at that moment, Grant pulled his stumpy legs from the floor, leaving Jim with his dead weight he couldn't hold. As Grant fell to the floor, a surprised doctor saw Craig level the gun at his now unprotected body, but it was Jim's head which burst open in a multicolored split second, leaving his body to slump over Grant, spurting blood and brain matter over his upturned, bald, bare, flat head. At the instant of his death, Jim's head almost sought revenge, blasting its contents onto Craig's face and open mouth. Single bodies lay there, the remains of the doctor pinning the heaving Grant to the swilling floor as he violently vomited in response to the emptying of Jim's neck and head. Craig was loving every second of it. He used his shotgun and held an expression of glee as to what the weapon had achieved, turning the weapon over and over in his filthy, sweating hands, as if admiring its aesthetic qualities.